I always thought family meant trust, honesty, and sacrifice. That's what I gave them. Every late night shift I pulled, every meal I skipped so they could eat, every dream I buried just so they could chase theirs. But then, life has a cruel way of showing you the truth, and it came wrapped in numbers on a bank statement I was never supposed to see. It happened by accident, really. One evening, I was sorting through some papers on the dining table, bills scattered everywhere. That's when I found it, a thin envelope tucked between grocery receipts. My hands shook as I pulled out the neatly folded sheet. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even supposed to be there, but it held the kind of secret that shatters trust forever. A bank account. One I didn't know existed. And the balance, more than I could ever dream of saving on my own. Tens of thousands, hidden, all while they let me believe we were drowning in debt. All while I worked myself to the bone, believing we were barely surviving. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, staring at the paper, my heart pounding like a war drum. I realized the betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about lies, about manipulation, about making me feel small while they thrived in secret. And in that silence, something inside me hardened. If they thought I'd never find out, if they thought I'd stay the naive fool forever, they were wrong. Because I wasn't going to just confront them. I was going to take back every piece of me they tried to steal. The next morning, I went about my day like nothing had happened. I made breakfast, washed the dishes, and even smiled when they asked me how I was. But inside, every glance, every word felt different. I kept seeing that piece of paper in my mind, the bank account, the balance, the proof of everything they'd hidden. I started to notice little details I'd ignored before. Their sudden generosity with themselves while claiming poverty, the expensive perfume that appeared on the dresser, the quiet exchanges of looks when bills were discussed. I had always brushed it off as my imagination, convincing myself they were just finding ways to make it work. But no, they had been living two lives, one in front of me, filled with scarcity and struggle, and another behind my back, filled with comfort, security, and secrets. At night, when the house grew quiet, I would lie awake replaying conversations. Every "we can't afford it" became a lie. Every time they made me feel guilty for wanting something small, a new pair of shoes, a book, even a cup of coffee, it all twisted into a betrayal that cut deeper than words could describe. But what stung the most wasn't just the hidden money. It was the realization that they never trusted me. They never included me. They looked at me like someone who could be deceived forever, someone who didn't matter enough to know the truth. That thought gnawed at me day and night. I wasn't angry anymore. I was cold. I was calculating. And as I sat at the kitchen table one evening, staring at the flickering light above, I made a silent vow to myself. If they thought I'd never find out, then they had underestimated me. And the day they realized what I was capable of would be the day their world fell apart. The days that followed were a strange performance. I played the role they expected of me, obedient, trusting, unaware. I laughed at their jokes, nodded when they complained about money, even offered to cut back on little things, just like I always had. And they, so confident in their lies, never noticed the shift in my eyes. They never saw the way I was watching them, memorizing every word, every slip of the tongue, every whispered conversation they thought I couldn't hear. The house itself began to feel different. Once it had been a place of warmth for me, even in hardship. I'd always believed we were united, struggling together against the world. But now, each room carried shadows. The living room where we sat pretending to be a family. The kitchen where they praised my sacrifices as though I should be proud of my restraint. Even my own bedroom where I would stare at the ceiling long into the night, wondering how deep their betrayal truly ran. One evening, I heard them talking in hushed voices. I was in my room, the door barely open, the sound of their laughter drifting through the hall. "We should take a trip," she whispered. "Just us, somewhere far. We can afford it now." "Not yet," he murmured back. "She'd ask too many questions. We need to wait a little longer." I pressed my hand against my chest, the sound of my heartbeat roaring in my ears. A trip. My sacrifices, my sleepless nights, my empty hands, all of it was fueling their plans for a vacation. A secret getaway, built on stolen trust. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my desk, staring at the glow of my lamp, the notebook open in front of me. I traced the numbers on the page with my fingertip, again and again, until they blurred. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, a thought crystallized in my mind. Clear, cold, unstoppable. If they could lie to me this easily, then I could show them how dangerous it was to underestimate me. The silence became my closest ally. Each day I learned to listen more than I spoke, to watch more than I reacted. And slowly the pieces of their betrayal stitched themselves into a picture too vivid to ignore. They were not just hiding money. They were hiding from me, from the very person who had trusted them the most. I began to notice their schedules, when they left the house, when they came home. The rhythm of their lives, the little patterns they thought were invisible. Every withdrawal, every casual conversation about budgeting while expensive deliveries arrived at the door, became part of a story I was no longer a character in. I was an observer, waiting for my cue. One evening, as they sat at the table, pretending to argue over bills, I sat across from them, quietly sipping my tea. Their voices rose, their performance polished, almost convincing. "We'll barely make it this month," she sighed, clutching her forehead dramatically. "Yes," he agreed. "We'll have to cut back again." I let the silence stretch before I looked up, my eyes steady. "You're right," I said softly. "I'll find a way to spend less." Their relief was instant, like watching masks snap back into place. They smiled at me. Oh, that smile. The kind of smile people give when they believe they fooled you. I held on to that smile like a weapon because I knew one day soon I'd wipe it off their faces. That night, alone in my room, I sat at the edge of my bed and opened my notebook again. The bank account number stared back at me, the balance unchanged but heavy with meaning. My hands trembled slightly as I touched the page. Not from fear, but from something sharper. Anticipation. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about showing them that their lies had not only been discovered, but punished. They thought I was powerless, naive, blind. But I had learned something they hadn't. Silence can be far louder than rage. The opportunity came unexpectedly. One morning, they left earlier than usual. A meeting, they claimed. Important. I watched from the window as the car pulled away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance, and for the first time in weeks, the house was mine. I sat at the desk, the bank's login page glowing faintly on the screen. My fingers hovered over the keys, my chest tightening with every second that passed. I could almost hear their voices in my head, mocking me, dismissing me, certain I would never uncover their secret. And then I typed. The numbers slid into place. The account opened, and there it was. The truth in digits, undeniable, unashamed. Line after line of transactions, luxuries disguised as necessities, trips disguised as work. Dinners disguised as networking. Every lie they had told me, every time they had made me feel guilty, every moment I had gone without, it was all right there, clear, mocking. I stared at the balance for a long time, my reflection faintly visible in the screen. A reflection of someone who had been betrayed, yes, but also someone who was no longer willing to be powerless. And as my hand reached for the mouse, my lips curved into the faintest of smiles. They thought I would never find out. They thought I would never act. They were wrong. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and the kind of quiet that pretends everything is normal. I told myself it was just another night. I told myself I would be the same obedient daughter who washed the dishes and pretended to sleep when the adults argued. But the truth sat heavy in my chest, and the numbers on that page burned behind my eyes. They had taught me to be small. They had taught me my worth was whatever they allowed. Tonight, I stopped pretending that lesson meant anything. When the clock nudged past midnight and the house finally surrendered to sleep, I slipped from my bed as if the floor could betray me by squeaking. I moved through the rooms like someone in a dream, familiar places suddenly foreign, each shadow a memory of some lie. In the living room, the photograph of our family smiled, bright and forgiving, and it made me sick. I didn't think about the rules. I didn't think about consequences. I thought only of the months and years of being gaslit, of being told our cupboards were bare while my parents tucked away luxuries behind closed doors. I thought of every time I swallowed my wants until there was nothing left to swallow. I thought of my own reflection, a small, furious thing who had finally learned the truth. I opened the laptop. I did not narrate the way I did what I did. The keys are not a lesson here. And secrecy is not something I want to teach anyone. What matters is the sound, the quiet authority of the cursor blinking, the slow realization rising in me like tidewater. The account existed. The numbers were there, luminous and obscene. I looked at them for a long time. There was a moment, brief and electric, where I felt like a god, or a criminal, depending on which word you want to affix to someone who has been taught to be powerless. I had wanted their faces to cringe the way mine had when they laughed at my dreams. I wanted them to feel the small, hungry thing I'd felt for years. So I did what felt inevitable. I reclaimed the thing they had hidden. I moved the life they had hoarded into a pocket that could never be shrugged away as not important. I turned their secret into consequence. The next morning, light came in through the slatted blinds like a courtroom. I stayed at the table and pretended to be the same girl who asked for breakfast. They were cheerful in their small ways, their voices lilted, unaware. I let them go on, counting their money and their jokes. And then the phone rang. My mother answered first. Her voice tightened at once, a note of confusion threading through her words. Then my father's chair screeched. He swore softly, then louder. I heard my name. Lily? The syllable sounding like an accusation. I watched them trade the looks I had watched them use on me for years. The quirk of a smile that could turn compassionate or cruel depending on audience. They called the bank. They called each other. More than once I heard panic, the kind that makes hands shake and sentences stutter. They didn't look at me. They looked at each other as if betrayal could be pushed back on some other invisible hand. At noon, my brother burst into my room. Ethan had always been dramatic, a man whose temper had been sharpened into performance. His face was pale, eyes frantic. He grabbed me roughly by the shoulders. His touch was not the careful one that picked me up when I fell as a child. It was an accusing grip, as if I had plucked the moon from the sky. "What did you do?" he demanded. His voice was not steady. "Who told you? Where did you—" He stopped, the words crumbling. The question was a ropeless net thrown into the air. I looked at him and let the silence be my answer. In that silence, I heard everything that had been censored about me for years. Their laughter when I wanted shoes, their excuses when I asked for new books, the casual way they'd say, "We can't afford it," all rehearsed lies. Clara came next, mascara smudged from crying or from fear. It was hard to tell. There was a pleading note to her that I'd never seen before. She tried the old tactics, charms I had once believed in, apologies she had practiced in the mirror, but even her voice betrayed a tremor. Pride cracks loud and strange when it's surprised. They said words aloud in different orders. "We didn't mean," "We were saving for," "You don't understand." How quickly the script dissolved when the lights come up. I didn't laugh. I didn't gloat. I sat very still, counting backward from 10, as my shocking new power hummed under the skin of my hands. The feeling wasn't triumph so much as cold clarity. I had forced truth into daylight. They could no longer pretend there were no funds, no hope of better, no comfortable life for them, and struggle for me. Neighbors called. Questions came from voices I recognized but had never expected to hear aligned with me. People we owed favors to, vendors, acquaintances, casual friends, began asking abrupt questions I was glad they asked. The world had a way of listening better when money was involved. By afternoon, my parents were paper thin. They went through the motions of making frantic phone calls and played out the theater of excuses, but someone had already looked them in the eye and smelled the lie. My father, who had been the kind of man who straightened napkins and corrected grammar at family dinners, paced with his hands in his hair. My mother turned pale in a way I had not seen since she was young. They were not the cruel monsters I had imagined. They were human, shivering under the weight of their own choices. That human trembling was my answer. Not revenge for revenge's sake, but balance. A ledger finally squared. Neighbors I had once avoided for fear they would overhear my family's supposed poverty now gathered stories like moths. The gardener, who had once smiled and refused to collect the extra he was owed, started asking questions. The delivery man, who had smiled when packages arrived for them and never for me, suddenly mentioned extravagant orders missing from his route. Little arms of gossip reached into the corners of my parents' carefully curated image and began to reveal cracks. That evening, at dinner, my mother refused to meet my eyes. She clasped her napkin with hands that trembled. My father muttered about bills and unexpected transfers. Clara accused me of vindictiveness, of cruelty. Ethan alternated between fury and pleading. There were words like family and forgiveness and mistake, spilled and then swallowed. I pushed my chair back slowly and spoke as if I were reading a weather report. You made choices for yourselves while asking me to make sacrifices for you. The difference today is that the ledger is visible. My voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. The proof had been made manifest. They called the bank again, and this time the bank called the police, because numbers that shift in the night raise questions, and questions raise investigations. I didn't call anyone. I didn't write an explanation. I let them sit in their new thinness and reckon with the arithmetic of what they had done. There is a peculiar kind of silence after a storm. Not the blank, numbing calm that takes away breath, but the careful pause where people test which things remain stable. For us, stability was not immediate. Instead,
everything moved into a brittle new arrangement. My parents argued like strangers, voices too loud in the kitchen so the whole block could hear. They discovered banks and lawyers and records and the terrible bureaucracy of undoing a family's choice. The neighbors watched. My aunt called with the voice of someone placing a bet on a fight she didn't want to join. People I had never spoken to picked sides like they were at a market choosing fruit. It was grotesque and ordinary.
Clara cried in a way that wanted voices to wrap her like a child. She was caught still in the center of the story she had written for herself, the one where she was lovely, admired, entitled. The collapse of that story couldn't be softened merely by tears. Ethan's temper turned inward. Where once he had swagger, now his shoulders bowed, as if the world had become too heavy. The police questioned us. The bank required statements. Family attorneys shuffled papers like priests at an altar. Some nights it felt like we were actors in a play we had not rehearsed for, and my role had changed from the naive daughter to the witness who would not lie. I expect people will ask me later whether I felt guilty. Maybe they already have. I felt things in that first week. A surprising emptiness, for one, because the act of taking away what had been hoarded didn't give me the glow of triumph I'd imagined. It gave me something more complicated, a slow, steady release of the fear that had lived in me. There were consequences I had not fully imagined. Friends of my parents withdrew calls, relationships frayed, invitations stopped. My father, who had measured himself by the respect of others, found fewer people willing to nod at his stories. My mother moved through the house with fewer smiles. At school, it was a different kind of attention. Some whispered, some congratulated me in hushed tones. The teacher who had once asked if everything was all right sat beside me in the hallway and said nothing at first, then squeezed my hand. "You did what you had to do," she said. "That matters." In that small acknowledgement, I felt the shape of myself tighten, like a muscle learning the use of a hand. My brother left town for a while, claiming to be sorting things out. Clara stayed, but she was a husk of the woman I once hoped would be my ally. We passed each other like strangers in a hallway. There were no sharp words anymore, only the thick, awkward quiet of people who had seen the worst in themselves reflected in another's eyes. Money does curious things to people. For some, it softens cruelty. For others, it magnifies it. For me, what it did was unmask them, and then, slowly, let me create margin to breathe. I took care to avoid gloating. There was no joy in humiliation, only relief. The empty nights where I was once taught to feel small were now bookended by mornings where I could write at the kitchen table without pretending to be asleep for the sake of their comfort. There were legal questions that followed, investigations into accounts, auditors asking for receipts, family lawyers parsing wills. I sat through some of the conversations that were meant to exclude me and listened to the words that had been used to keep me small. Incapable, too young, not ready. Now the same words were used to describe their culpability in shivery tones. The world has an odd appetite for civilization. Once a family's tidy facade is cracked, strangers step in, not always to help, but to record. What I learned in the months that followed was less about money than about boundary and truth. I learned that the people who love you will tell you the truth in a way that doesn't cut you, and the people who don't will weave just enough tenderness to keep you bound. I learned that power is not always the loudest sound, and that the smallest voices, when given the space to speak, can rewrite the ledger. One afternoon, months later, I sat with my mother on the porch. There was still a frost to her eyes, and perhaps always would be. She tried to apologize.
Her words sounded like someone trying to fit into a dress 2 sizes too small. She said, "We thought it was for the family. We thought we were protecting you." There was remorse there, yes, but it arrived late and burdened with the memory of how it had been spent. I forgave in the way that rearranged my heart for my own peace, not as a blanket that covered their deeds. Forgiveness, in my experience, is not a single act, but a series of small choices. To stop rehearsing the hurt, to stop letting it be your only story, to keep making bread in the kitchen that remembers both pain and recovery.
People will tell you revenge is empty. Maybe sometimes it is. But the thing they never say is this. Sometimes when someone has spent your life convincing you that you don't matter, having the audacity to reclaim what is yours is not revenge, it's repair. I don't know what the future will hold for my family. There are cracks we may never fill. There are apologies that might always carry a sour aftertaste. But I do know the person I became in the wake of their secret, quieter in some places, louder in others, will not go back to being small for the comfort of others. At night, when I open the notebook where I had once written the numbers over and over, I don't feel triumphant anymore. I feel steady, like someone who has stood through wind and still kept their roots. If anyone asks me about that night, the night I emptied a bank account that had been hidden from me, I will tell them the truth plainly. It was not about greed. It was about reclamation. It was about refusing to be the character others wrote for me. It was about speaking the truth that had been held under lock and letting the consequences rest on those who chose secrecy instead of family. They told me I was too young to understand. I hope, now, they understand that understanding is not the peril they imagined. Understanding can be a kind of armor. It can make you careful, yes, but also brave. And once you have it, you don't have to return to the boy or girl others expected you to be. You can become yourself.